Children of the Conquest, The Legacy of Latin America, Part 1. Introduction: The Encounter of Two Worlds. In the year 1492, the world known to Europeans was undergoing a profound transformation. The Iberian Peninsula had just lived its moment of glory. After nearly 8 centuries of struggle, the Christian kingdoms completed the Reconquista with the capture of Granada, the last Muslim stronghold in Spain. That same year, King Ferdinand of Aragon and Queen Isabella of Castile consolidated their authority over a unified realm and prepared to project their power beyond the borders of the continent. It was a time of enthusiasm but also of uncertainty, an age in which Europe stood at a crossroads between the Middle Ages and the dawn of modernity. In this context, a Genoese navigator, Christopher Columbus, won the support of the Crown of Castile for a plan that at the time seemed risky and audacious. He proposed a sea route to Asia by sailing westward across the Sea of Darkness, that is, the Atlantic Ocean. The stated goal was to find a quicker path to the riches of the East, spices, silks, gold, that reached Europe through long and dangerous routes, largely controlled by the Ottomans and Italian merchants. For the Spanish monarchs, the gamble was immense. Opening a direct route to Asia meant access to almost unlimited resources and the consolidation of the prestige of the newly unified kingdom. On August 3, 1492, 3 caravels, the Santa Maria, the Pinta, and the Nina, set sail from the port of Palos de la Frontera. After more than 2 months at sea, on October 12, the sailors sighted land. Columbus was convinced he had reached the Indies, but in reality, he had revealed to Europe a new world, the islands of the Caribbean. The first contacts with the indigenous peoples, whom he called Indians, were peaceful. These peoples, mainly belonging to the Taino culture, proved hospitable, curious, and lacking sophisticated weapons. Columbus noted in his diary that they were friendly and could be converted to Christianity with ease and turned into subjects of the Spanish crown. Yet behind these seemingly benevolent observations lay a harsher reality. Europeans looked at those lands and peoples through the prism of their own interests, wealth, prestige, and faith. Columbus had not merely discovered new islands, he had opened the door to a collision between 2 entirely different worlds. For Europeans, this was the opportunity for unprecedented expansion. For the Amerindian peoples, it was the beginning of a catastrophe that would change their lives forever. In the years that followed, Columbus undertook 3 more expeditions. He founded the first colonies on Hispaniola, present-day Haiti and the Dominican Republic, but conflicts with the indigenous peoples broke out quickly. The Spaniards were looking for gold, and when they did not find it, they imposed forced labor and tributes on the local populations. Against this regime, the natives rebelled, but their stone and wooden weapons could not compete with iron swords, crossbows, or the war dogs brought from Europe. Moreover, European diseases, smallpox, measles, influenza, spread with devastating speed, decimating entire communities with no natural immunity. This first phase of the conquest was neither organized nor grand, as the later campaigns in Mexico and Peru would be. But it laid the foundations of a pattern. Explorers, adventurers, and soldiers set out on expeditions backed by the crown, or privately financed, conquered territories, subjugated local populations, and sent gold, silver, and other riches to Spain. In return, the crown granted them titles, privileges, and land. The encomienda system, introduced in these early colonies, gave colonists the right to exploit the labor of indigenous people, in exchange for the obligation to evangelize and protect them. In practice, this system quickly turned into a brutal form of slavery. For Spain, however, the results were spectacular. In just a few years, the kingdom had become an emerging colonial power, with possessions across the ocean and enormous potential for expansion. The success of Columbus's expeditions inspired other adventurers, known as conquistadors. Most were impoverished nobles, seasoned soldiers, or even common men seeking a fortune and social status impossible to attain in their homeland. For them, America was a promise: gold, land, and glory. Thus, between the late 15th and early 16th centuries, two worlds looked each other in the eye for the first time. This encounter did not give rise to dialogue, but to conquest. Spain was not interested in understanding the cultures it encountered, but in subjugating them and integrating them into its new empire. And the native peoples, although numerous and united by strong traditions, found themselves powerless before an adversary who brought unknown weapons, horses, an intolerant religion, and a boundless desire for conquest. The beginning of the 16th century was therefore a turning point in human history. Columbus's discovery of America was not merely a maritime adventure, but the starting point of a process that would lead to the destruction of great civilizations, and at the same time, to the birth of a new world, Latin America. A world that still bears the marks of that dramatic encounter between Europe and the Americas. Part 2. The first settlements and the encomienda system. After Christopher Columbus's first voyages, enthusiasm for the newly discovered lands grew rapidly in Castile. Tales of islands covered with lush vegetation, rivers that seemed to contain gold, and peoples who appeared hospitable and unarmed fired the imagination of an entire generation of adventurers. Within less than 2 decades of 1492, the Spanish crown organized numerous expeditions in the Caribbean region, and soon islands such as Hispaniola, Cuba, and Puerto Rico became the first bastions of the Spanish Empire in the New World. Hispaniola, the island Columbus had designated as the center of his discoveries, became the first major colony. Founded in 1493, it was seen as the model for what future overseas possessions would be. There the Spaniards built cities, forts, churches, and a rudimentary colonial administration. The city of Santo Domingo, founded in 1498, became the first European capital on the American continent and the nucleus of political, military, and religious power in the Caribbean. From its walls departed expeditions that explored nearby islands, and later, the continental coasts. The rapid consolidation of these colonies was not free of violence. From the outset, the conquistadors demanded tributes from the Taíno peoples and imposed forced labor. The natives had to deliver gold, cotton, and food, in addition to working on the construction of fortresses and in the fields. The clash was brutal. Societies that had lived under communal systems and their own rituals suddenly found themselves subjected to impossible demands. Those who failed to deliver the required amount of gold suffered severe punishments, including mutilation and death. Faced with this situation, the indigenous population of Hispaniola began to resist. In 1495, the first rebellions broke out, led by caciques such as Caonabo and Guarionex. Although brave and determined, their warriors could not withstand Spanish military superiority, steel swords, armor, horses, and war dogs. In barely a decade, the uprisings were crushed with extreme harshness, and the Taíno communities were devastated. The arrival of unknown diseases, such as smallpox and measles, accelerated the demographic collapse even further. It is estimated that by around 1515, the indigenous population of Hispaniola had fallen from several 100,000 people to only a few tens of thousands. To organize and justify the colonial system, the Crown introduced a model that would profoundly mark the beginnings of the conquest: the encomienda. Under this regime, a Spanish settler, the encomendero, received a group of natives who were obliged to work for him. In return, the encomendero had the obligation to protect them and instruct them in the Christian faith. In theory, it was a system of tutelage and evangelization. In practice, it became a mechanism of ruthless exploitation, close to slavery. The encomendero used indigenous labor in mines, plantations, and infrastructure works. Gold from Caribbean rivers began to flow to Seville, swelling the royal coffers. On the plantations, Tainos cultivated sugarcane, which soon became a central product of Atlantic trade. The lives of indigenous people were marked by exhausting workdays, cruel punishments, and the disintegration of their traditional communities. The Taino social structure, based on chiefdoms and family alliances, was destroyed within a few decades. Not all Spaniards accepted this model without criticism. Friars such as Antonio de Montesinos and, later, Bartolomé de las Casas denounced the abuses vehemently. In 1511, Montesinos delivered a sermon in Santo Domingo in which he accused the encomenderos of committing mortal sins against indigenous peoples and of living in a permanent state of injustice. His words resounded throughout the colony and marked the beginning of a moral and legal debate that would accompany the conquest for centuries. Did the natives have souls? Were they legitimate subjects of the crown, or merely resources to be exploited? Many colonists responded with rejection and hostility toward the friars, but the accusations could not be entirely ignored. Over time, pressure from figures like de las Casas led to the promulgation of new laws, such as the Laws of Burgos of 1512, which attempted to regulate the encomienda system. These laws established, in theory, limits on exploitation, shorter workdays, mandatory rest, and the obligation to instruct natives in Christianity. In practice, however, the measures were almost impossible to enforce in far-off territories where encomenderos exercised near absolute power. Meanwhile, the Caribbean colonies became strategic centers for expansion. From Cuba, conquered beginning in 1511 under the command of Diego Velázquez, Hernán Cortés would set out in 1519 toward the coasts of Mexico. Puerto Rico, colonized in 1508, became a key point for controlling maritime routes. The islands, soon exhausted of mineral resources and demographically devastated, served as launchpads for far more ambitious enterprises, the conquest of the great continental empires. Thus, the first settlements not only consolidated Spain's power in America, but also established the pattern of relations between colonizers and indigenous peoples, a system of economic domination, labor exploitation, and forced evangelization. The Caribbean was, in a sense, the laboratory of conquest. There, strategies of control were tested, mechanisms of exploitation refined, and the conquistador mentality forged that would guide Cortés in Mexico and Pizarro in Peru. The human cost was devastating. In barely a generation, entire cultures disappeared or were reduced to small, marginalized communities. The wound opened in the Caribbean foreshadowed what would later occur on the continent, the fall of entire civilizations before a handful of conquistadors who combined ambition, faith, and violence. Far from being an anomaly, the encomienda system became the cornerstone of colonial organization for much of the 16th century. Under its shadow, the new American society was shaped, marked by inequality, mestizaje, and the imposition of an order entirely foreign to local traditions. Part 3. The Conquest of Mexico. In 1519, an expedition that set sail from Cuba would change the history of the Americas forever. At its head was an ambitious and astute hidalgo from Extremadura, Hernán Cortés. His official objective was to explore the coasts of Yucatan, but in reality he had in mind a far greater enterprise: to conquer continental territories and open for Spain an empire without precedent. When Cortés's ships reached the coasts of Veracruz, the Spaniards encountered a world very different from the Caribbean islands. There stretched the powerful Mexica Empire known as the Aztecs, a civilization that dominated much of Mesoamerica. Under the rule of the Tlatoani Moctezuma II, the Mexica controlled a vast network of city-states, imposed tributes on subject peoples, and maintained a complex religious and military structure. Tenochtitlan, their capital, erected in the middle of Lake Texcoco, was a monumental city with causeways, temples, markets, and gardens that amazed Europeans with its size and sophistication. Cortés quickly realized that to confront an empire of millions, the few hundred men who accompanied him would not be enough. He therefore applied a strategy that would prove decisive, weaving alliances with the enemies of the Mexica. Many peoples of the region resented Aztec rule, particularly the harsh tribute demands and the human sacrifices that sustained the Mexica religion. Among these peoples, Tlaxcala stood out, a confederation that first fought the Spaniards fiercely, but later became their most faithful ally. Thousands of Tlaxcalan warriors joined Cortés's ranks, turning his small expedition into a considerable military force. With these alliances, Cortés advanced toward the heart of the empire. In November 1519 he entered Tenochtitlan, where he was received by Moctezuma in an atmosphere of tension and curiosity. Chroniclers tell that the Aztec emperor initially believed the Spaniards might be envoys of the gods, which facilitated a peaceful entry. The Europeans were astonished by the magnificence of the city: straight streets, navigable canals, palaces, and a market at Tlatelolco that gathered tens of thousands of people each day. To the conquistadors' eyes, this metropolis rivaled the great cities of Europe, but coexistence was fragile. The Spaniards' demands for gold, their attitude toward indigenous temples, and their contempt for religious rituals ignited Mexica hostility. In 1520, while Cortés was away to confront an expedition sent from Cuba to arrest him, his men under Pedro de Alvarado perpetrated a massacre during a religious ceremony at the Templo Mayor. The incident unleashed a massive uprising in the city. When Cortés returned, he found himself surrounded by thousands of Mexica warriors. During the so-called Night of Sorrows, La Noche Triste, on June 30, 1520, the Spaniards and their Tlaxcalan allies attempted to flee the city, suffering enormous losses. Hundreds died in the canals and on the causeways, weighed down by gold and weapons. Despite the disaster, Cortés did not give up. He reorganized his forces in Tlaxcala and, for months, prepared a counterattack. With indigenous support, he built brigantines to control Lake Texcoco and isolate the Aztec capital. In May 1521, the siege of Tenochtitlan began. For 3 months the city resisted heroically, but hunger, disease, and a systematic blockade undermined its defense. On August 13, 1521, Cuauhtémoc, the last Tlatoani, was captured. Great Tenochtitlan fell, and with it, one of the most powerful empires of the Americas. The conquest of Mexico was not only a military triumph, but also an unparalleled cultural clash. The Spaniards destroyed temples and erected churches on their ruins. They introduced Christianity, the encomienda system, and a new political structure under the viceroyalty. The allied peoples who had seen in Cortés an opportunity to free themselves from the Mexica yoke soon realized that they had merely exchanged one master for another. Spanish rule proved as demanding and violent as that of the Aztecs, with one decisive difference: they were now integrated into a global empire that connected America with Europe and Asia. The human impact was devastating. Smallpox, brought by the conquistadors themselves, spread rapidly in 1520 and decimated the indigenous population, weakening Mexica defenses during the siege. In just a few years, millions of inhabitants disappeared. Spanish chroniclers acknowledged that without the epidemic, the conquest would have been much more difficult. From a European perspective, victory opened the door to incalculable wealth. The gold and, later the silver of Mexico began to flow to Spain. The city of Mexico was founded on the ruins of Tenochtitlan and became the capital of the Viceroyalty of New Spain, one of the most important territories of the Spanish monarchy. From there, new expeditions were organized north and south, extending Spanish influence across vast regions of the continent. The conquest of Mexico symbolizes, like few episodes, the complexity of European expansion in the Americas, a mixture of military violence, strategic alliances, epidemic catastrophes, and cultural transformations. It was the beginning of a new era, in which entire peoples saw their ancestral worlds collapse to give way to a colonial reality that, with its lights and shadows, would shape the destiny of all Latin America. Part 4: The Conquest of Peru. While Spanish rule was being consolidated in Mexico, farther south another age-old empire rose in the Andean highlands, the Inca Empire. With its capital at Cusco, and extending from what is now Colombia to Chile and Argentina, the Incas had, in a few generations, built an impressive network of roads, fortresses, and administrative centers. It was a centralized empire, ruled by the Sapa Inca, considered a direct descendant of the sun god. Its society was organized into ailas, or communities, bound together by a system of tribute and collective labor known as the Maita. To European eyes, it was a powerful, disciplined civilization, with abundant riches in gold and silver. However, when the Spaniards reached these lands in the 1530s, the empire was in a critical situation. A devastating smallpox epidemic, arriving before the conquistadors, had killed thousands, including the Emperor Huayna Capac himself. After his death, his sons Huascar and Atahualpa fought a bloody civil war for the throne. Although Atahualpa prevailed, the conflict had left the empire weakened and divided, just as strange newcomers appeared on the coast. In 1532, an expedition led by Francisco Pizarro, a man of humble origin with long experience in Caribbean and Panamanian campaigns, landed in what is now Peru. Pizarro commanded barely 180 men and a handful of horses, but like Cortés in Mexico, he knew how to exploit the political situation and the empire's internal divisions. With cunning, he requested an interview with Atahualpa in the plaza of Cajamarca. What happened there is one of the most dramatic episodes in the history of the conquest. Confident in his numerical superiority, Atahualpa came to the meeting accompanied by thousands of warriors, unarmed out of respect for the parley. The Spaniards, hidden around the square, laid an ambush. After a brief exchange in which a friar presented the Christian faith and demanded Atahualpa's submission to the Spanish crown, the conquistadors opened fire with arquebuses and cannon, and charged with their horses. The result was a massacre. Hundreds of Incas died within minutes, while Atahualpa was captured alive. With this audacious action, Pizarro had beheaded the leadership of the empire with barely a handful of men. A prisoner, Atahualpa tried to buy his freedom by offering a colossal ransom, one room filled with gold and two with silver, up to a market height. For months, his subjects brought unimaginable treasures to the Spanish camp, melted into ingots, and pieces of goldwork destroyed to facilitate transport. It was one of the greatest hoards in history, but despite fulfilling the promise, Atahualpa was summarily tried for heresy and conspiracy and executed in 1533. His death left the empire without a visible head, and the conquerors advanced into the heart of the Andes. That same year, the Spaniards entered Cuzco, the sacred capital of the Incas. Although the city was taken, indigenous resistance did not disappear. Manco Inca, a member of the royal family who initially allied with the Spaniards, rebelled in 1536 and organized a massive siege of Cuzco. For months, thousands of warriors surrounded the city and inflicted heavy losses on the conquistadors. However, Spanish superiority in arms and the rebels' lack of coordination eventually weakened the uprising. Manco Inca retreated to Vilcabamba, where he founded a redoubt of resistance that would endure for several decades as a symbol of the indomitable Inca spirit. Consolidating Spanish rule was slow and violent. In 1535, Pizarro founded the city of Lima, which soon became the new capital of the viceroyalty due to its access to the sea and its connection to trade routes to Panama and Seville. From there, the vast territory of Peru was organized, and it soon became one of the main sources of wealth for the Spanish Empire, thanks to its silver mines, especially those of Potosi in present-day Bolivia. Intensive extraction of precious metals transformed the local economy and had global repercussions. The constant flow of American silver fueled the European economy and allowed Spain to sustain its wars in Europe and its role as a great world power. The cultural shock was equally profound. Inca temples and palaces were destroyed or converted into churches and colonial buildings. Christianity was imposed as the official faith, although many indigenous people secretly preserved their traditions and beliefs, giving rise to a religious syncretism that still endures. The meter system was adapted by the Spaniards to exploit indigenous labor in mines and haciendas, in conditions so harsh that they provoked an alarming demographic decline. Millions of Andeans died in forced labor, as their communities were torn apart by the imposition of colonial authority. Internal disputes among the conquistadors themselves added further violence to the process. Pizarro's brothers, together with other captains such as Diego de Almagro, fought civil wars for control of the new lands and riches. In 1541, Francisco Pizarro himself was assassinated in Lima by rival Spaniards. But by then, the conquest of Peru was already consummated. The Inca Empire had disappeared as an independent political entity, and on its ruins, a new colonial order was rising. The conquest of Peru stands as one of the most shocking episodes in world history. In a matter of a few years, an empire of millions with a millennial cultural tradition fell before a small band of foreigners. It was not solely military superiority that decided the outcome, but also disease, internal divisions, strategic cunning, and the conqueror's brutality. The legacy was contradictory, the destruction of civilizations, but also the birth of a new mestizo reality that would define the face of Latin America. Part 5. The Cultural and Human Collision. The Spanish conquest of the Americas did not end with the military defeat of empires such as the Mexica and the Inca. What followed was a much deeper and more painful process. A cultural and human collision that forever transformed millions of people and reshaped the map of world history. The encounter between Europeans and indigenous peoples was not a simple contact between civilizations, but a collision marked by violence, disease, exploitation, and, at the same time, the creation of new ways of life, new identities, and new societies. One of the most devastating factors was the impact of diseases brought from Europe. Smallpox, measles, influenza, and typhus spread with terrifying speed among populations that had no immunological defenses against them. Entire epidemics swept through villages and cities, leaving ghost communities in their wake. In Mexico, smallpox proved decisive during the siege of Tenochtitlan in 1521. It weakened Mexica defenses, decimated their warriors, and sowed panic. In the Andes, plagues preceded even Pizarro's arrival, weakening the Inca Empire before the first shot was fired. It is estimated that in less than a century, the native population of the Americas fell from some 60 to 70 million inhabitants to barely 10 million. It was a demographic catastrophe without parallel in history. Religious change was equally radical. Convinced of the superiority of their faith, the Spaniards embarked on evangelization with unyielding zeal. Indigenous temples were destroyed or transformed into churches. Idols were burned. Ancestral rituals were banned. Dominican, Franciscan, and Jesuit missionaries played a key role, teaching catechism in local languages, translating the Bible, and building parishes. Yet evangelization did not entail the total disappearance of pre-Hispanic beliefs. In many places, indigenous peoples integrated Christian symbols into their traditions, giving rise to religious syncretism. Emblematic examples include devotion to the Virgin of Guadalupe in Mexico, soon identified with ancient fertility deities, or in the Andes, the fusion of the cult of the sun, Inti, with the figure of Christ. Agricultural festivities such as Inti Raymi were officially replaced by Christian celebrations, but in practice preserved traditional elements. Thus, the imposed faith was transformed into a living mixture that still defines Latin American spirituality. Another fundamental aspect was the transformation of work and daily life. Communal systems of production and redistribution, such as the Calpulli in Mesoamerica or the Ailu in the Andes, were replaced by colonial structures of exploitation. The encomienda system, already consolidated in the Caribbean, spread to the continent, forcing indigenous people to work in fields and mines. In the Andes, the old mita system was adapted to supply forced labor to the silver mines of Potosi, where thousands of workers died under inhuman conditions. The wealth thus generated filled the Spanish crown's coffers, but at the cost of countless lives. The cultural clash also manifested itself in diet and agriculture. Europeans introduced animals such as the horse, cattle, pigs, and sheep, which radically transformed landscapes and local diets. At the same time, products native to the Americas, maize, potatoes, cacao, tomatoes, and chili peppers, crossed the Atlantic and revolutionized global gastronomy. This exchange, known as the Columbian Exchange, changed not only the Americas and Europe, but all of humanity. The mixing of populations was another of the most visible legacies. Spaniards and indigenous peoples, joined in unequal relationships often marked by violence, gave rise to mestizaje. Over time, a complex social hierarchy based on ethnic origin emerged. At the top were the Peninsulares, Spaniards born in Europe, followed by the Criollos, descendants of Spaniards but born in the Americas. Below them were mestizos, indigenous people, and African slaves, whose presence increased with the slave trade intended to make up for the drastic decline of the indigenous population. From these combinations arose intermediate categories, mulattoes, zambos, that reflected a society obsessed with origin and purity of blood. This caste system defined colonial life for centuries and sowed inequalities that still endure. Culturally, the arrival of alphabetic writing, European law, and administration profoundly transformed indigenous societies. Universities, colleges, and seminaries were founded. Books were printed in native languages such as Nahuatl or Quechua. and some indigenous people learned to use the tools of Spanish law to defend their communities. Figures such as Felipe Guamán Poma de Ayala in Peru wrote chronicles denouncing colonial abuses and demanding justice from the King of Spain. These testimonies reveal that, although dominated, indigenous peoples were not mere passive victims, but active agents who sought to adapt and resist within the new order. The human collision was also psychological and symbolic. For indigenous peoples, the fall of their gods, the destruction of their temples, and the imposition of a new order meant a collective trauma of enormous proportions. For the Spaniards, by contrast, the conquest was seen as a divine undertaking, a mission that justified violence in the name of faith and civilization. This contrast of visions reflects the depth of the cultural rift opened in those years. Despite the brutality, the loss of life, and the oppression, spaces of resistance and resilience also emerged. Indigenous communities managed to preserve their languages, their festivals, and parts of their worldviews. Music, art, and popular traditions became vehicles of memory. In many cases, the indigenous and the European fused, guitars accompanying traditional dances, virgins adorned with agricultural symbols, cities that combined Spanish plazas with pre-Hispanic layouts. The end result of this collision was not the simple disappearance of one culture before another, but the birth of a new mestizo civilization. Latin America is the child of that collision, of bloodshed, of a faith imposed and transformed, of shared flavors and interwoven languages. The human cost was immense, but out of that tragedy arose a new, unprecedented, complex, and contradictory reality that continues to shape the identity of millions to this day. Part 6. Consequences and Legacy. The conquest of the Americas was, without doubt, one of the most momentous events in world history. It was not merely the expansion of a European kingdom into new lands, but the beginning of a global process that irreversibly transformed the fate of entire continents. In a few decades, millennia-old societies collapsed, new political and economic structures arose, and a mestizo civilization was born that, with all its contradictions, today forms the heart of Latin America. Politically, the conquest gave rise to a colonial system without precedent. The Spanish crown established viceroyalties, such as New Spain and Peru, that became pillars of an empire on which the sun never set. These territories were governed by viceroys, direct representatives of the king, and had audiencias, cabildos, and a whole bureaucratic network designed to maintain control from the peninsula. In this way, they were integrated into the global space, under the authority of the Habsburgs first and the Bourbons later. Economically, the conquest meant the opening of a new era of interconnections. Silver from Potosi and Zacatecas, gold from the Caribbean and New Granada, and agricultural products such as sugar and cacao fueled world trade. Seville, and later Cadiz, became the great ports of entry for these riches into Europe. The massive flow of precious metals had ambivalent effects. On the one hand, it financed Spain's expansion in Europe and allowed the monarchy to sustain wars and imperial policies. On the other, it provoked uncontrolled inflation on the peninsula and an excessive dependence on external resources. America thus became the economic engine of the empire, though at the cost of the brutal exploitation of millions of indigenous people and African slaves. The human price was incalculable. Demographic catastrophe drastically reduced the native population, not only because of disease, but also because of wars, forced labor, and the disruption of their ways of life. Many languages disappeared, countless traditions were lost, and entire communities were pushed into marginalization. To this was added the arrival of millions of enslaved Africans, torn from their lands and forced to work on the plantations and in the mines of the New World. Colonial society was, to a great extent, a society built upon violence and inequality. The caste system reflected that reality. Peninsulares and criollos occupied the upper levels of the social pyramid, while mestizos, indigenous people, blacks and mulattoes, were relegated to lower positions. Racial and ethnic discrimination became institutionalized, and, although these divisions softened over time, their imprint is still present in many Latin American societies. The heritage of colonialism is, therefore, also a heritage of inequality. Even so, from this history of violence and domination, there also emerged a unique cultural legacy. The fusion of European, indigenous and African traditions gave rise to artistic, literary and musical expressions without parallel. In architecture, Baroque cathedrals rose upon ancient pyramids. In painting, Christian saints adopted local features. In music, Spanish guitars blended with African drums and indigenous flutes. Latin America became a space of mestizo creativity, where the pain of the past was transformed into new forms of beauty. Religion is perhaps the field where this syncretism is most strongly perceived. Although Christianity was imposed as the official faith, in practice it mixed with native elements. The Virgin of Guadalupe in Mexico, or the Lord of Miracles in Peru, are examples of deeply popular devotions that integrate indigenous symbols within the Catholic framework. Latin American religiosity, vibrant and diverse, is the fruit of that process of encounter and resistance. In the realm of language, Spanish consolidated itself as the dominant tongue, but it coexists to this day with dozens of native languages such as Quechua, Nahuatl, Guarani, and Aymara. This coexistence, often conflictive, reminds us that Latin American identity is not homogeneous but plural. Colonization was not a one-way process. Over the centuries, indigenous peoples and Afro-descendant communities found ways to resist. Open rebellions, such as those of Tupac Amaru in the 18th century, or everyday resistance, preserving languages, rituals, and forms of communal organization. These struggles left an imprint of dignity that continues to inspire today's social movements in Latin America. The essential contradiction of the conquest lies in the fact that, even as it generated oppression and suffering, it also laid the foundations of a new identity. Latin America is not only the heir of Spain, but also of the indigenous and African cultures that survived and were transformed. That mixture is at once the pain and the wealth of its history. Today, 5 centuries later, the conquest remains a subject of passionate debate. For some, it represents the start of modernity and the incorporation of the Americas into global history. For others, it is synonymous with genocide, dispossession, and exploitation. Both approaches contain part of the truth. The conquest cannot be understood without recognizing its lights and shadows. It was at once creation and destruction, integration and exclusion, evangelization and oppression. Spanish colonialism left deep marks that are still perceived. Unequal social structures, economies dependent on the export of raw materials, and a historical memory marked by trauma. But it also left a common language, a shared religion, and a set of cultural traditions that, over time, became defining features of identity. The legacy of the conquest is, ultimately, ambivalent. Without it, Latin America as we know it would not exist, a continent united by Spanish and Portuguese, with a mestizo culture that has offered the world unique literature, music, gastronomy, and ways of thinking. At the same time, that identity was built upon the blood of millions of people, upon the destruction of entire civilizations, and upon the imposition of an unjust order. The history of the conquest is therefore a history of contradictions. It speaks to us of the human capacity to create new worlds out of pain, of violence turned into art, of oppression transformed into resistance. It is a warning and at the same time a source of identity. 5 centuries later, the echo of that encounter between two worlds still resounds. The conquest of the Americas was not a simple military episode, but the beginning of a global era in which Europe, Africa, and the Americas became intertwined forever. It was tragedy and it was genesis. It was catastrophe and it was birth. Out of its ashes arose Latin America, a region that to this day carries the memory of suffering, but also the richness of its cultural diversity. To understand that past, with its lights and shadows, is essential to understanding Latin American identity and the place it occupies in the contemporary world.